Alone for years, he never expected 11 alien widows to change his life forever. The prairie stretched wide under the vast Texan sky, golden fields swaying with the late summer wind. Out here, 30 miles from the nearest town, silence was a companion more loyal than any neighbor. The only sound came from the creak of the wooden windmill and the occasional bellow of cattle far across the plain. For 17 years, Richard Hale had lived like this, retired, widowed, a man whose heart had rusted in the absence of company. His ranch was weathered but sturdy, a stubborn shape of red barn and white-painted house against the horizon. Every morning, Richard walked the porch with a cup of coffee that had long since lost its taste. He didn't mind the quiet anymore. Or maybe he told himself that so often it had become a kind of shield. Tonight, though, something was different. The sky pulsed. At first, Richard thought it was heat lightning, strange in this season, but not impossible. Then the pulse repeated, violet against the stars, sharper than any storm. He squinted, the cup trembling slightly in his hand. The dogs barked, then whimpered, hiding under the steps. And then he saw it. A streak tore through the heavens, burning violet white, a wound across the night sky. Richard's breath caught. It wasn't a plane, wasn't a meteor. Whatever it was coming down fast, straight toward the plains behind his ranch. The ground shuddered when it hit. Dust rose on the horizon like a rising storm. His first thought, government testing. His second, he didn't care. He wanted no part of it. But his legs betrayed him, pulling him toward his truck. Old habits of curiosity, the same ones that had carried him through years as a border patrol officer, still lived in his bones. When he reached the crash site, his headlights caught a shape. Metal, twisted, glowing with an inner violet fire. Not aircraft. Not anything he'd seen in war or peace. It looked alive, as if the wreckage itself breathed. And then he heard them. Soft cries, almost like wind at first, but layered, many voices weaving together. Richard stepped closer, his boots sinking into the scorched earth. Shapes moved within the haze of smoke. Figures stumbled forward, clutching one another, their silhouettes tall and thin, their movements weak. When the smoke cleared, he froze. 11 women. Not human. Their skin shimmered purple, reflecting the moonlight with a faint glow, as if bruised galaxies had taken form upon their flesh. Their hair was pure white, long and flowing, untouched by ash or flame. Their eyes, silver, liquid, wide with grief, met his in silence. They were beautiful, but not in any earthly way. They carried a sorrow, so heavy it seemed to bend the air around them. The tallest stepped forward. Her voice trembled, melodic but strained, as though translated through an unseen thread between worlds. Please, we have nowhere else. Richard blinked, heart hammering. His rational mind screamed. This was impossible. Yet the dust on his boots, the smoke in his lungs, the weight of their gaze, told him it was real. Another woman, younger perhaps, staggered, clutching her side. He saw dark fluid seeping from a wound. Not blood, not as he knew it. His instinct, buried beneath years of bitterness, kicked alive. He reached for her, steadying her, as though she were any traveler in need. You can't stay out here, Richard muttered. His voice shook more than he wanted. Come with me. The ranch isn't far. The 11 exchanged glances, silent words passing among them. Grief and hesitation wove across their faces. Finally, they nodded. So it was that Richard Hale, the man who had convinced himself he would die alone, led 11 alien widows across the dark prairie, their glowing forms trailing behind like lanterns in the night. Back at the ranch, Richard hurried them inside. The house smelled of dust and old wood, a place not meant for company. Yet the women stepped across the threshold with reverence, as though entering sanctuary. They moved with grace, but exhaustion clung to every step. They sat crowded in his living room, the old leather couch and chairs barely enough. Richard brought water in glass tumblers, watching as they lifted them to their lips carefully, unsure at first, then drinking with desperate need. The eldest among them, her posture regal, her eyes endless pools of silver sorrow, spoke again. We were wives. Our mates fell in war. Our world burned. We fled, but the stars gave us no mercy. Now, only we remain. Richard swallowed. Their pain was palpable, thick in the air. He thought of the day his wife had died, how silence had become his prison. Multiply that grief by 11, by the destruction of an entire homeworld. It was unbearable. And yet, here they were. Stay, he said before he could stop himself. This place isn't much, but it's safe. The women lowered their heads, as if his offer was more than shelter, more than they had hoped for. Some wept softly. One reached out, her hand trembling, fingertips brushing his rough wrist. The touch carried warmth that went beyond skin, as if sorrow itself had found a brief refuge. That night, the ranch changed. Once silent, it now hummed with life not of this earth. Richard lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of strangers breathing in the rooms below. Strangers who were no longer strangers. And he knew. His life had been rewritten in a single night. Morning came harsh and golden. Richard woke to the smell of coffee, but not his own. For years he had brewed a bitter pot each sunrise, more out of habit than taste. But now, from the kitchen below, a fragrance drifted upward, richer, spiced, almost floral. He sat up, confused. His body ached the way it always did, the joints stiff from age and years of hard work. But his senses felt sharper than usual. Voices, soft, melodic, not quite human, echoed faintly from the kitchen. When he descended the stairs, the sight made him stop cold. The 11 women moved through his kitchen like dancers in some strange ritual. They touched every object, pans, cups, utensils, as though studying artifacts of another age. One of them, her long white hair bound loosely, stood over the stove. She had coaxed his battered coffee maker into brewing something entirely new. A violet shimmer rose from the liquid. Richard frowned. You shouldn't mess with that. The woman turned, smiling faintly, her silver eyes bright. We wish to honor you. Your shelter gave us life. Let's give you warmth. He hesitated, then accepted the cup she offered. The liquid glowed faintly in the morning light. One sip, and his breath caught. Sweet, deep, unlike anything he had tasted. It carried a heat that seemed to burn through fatigue itself. Damn, Richard muttered, shaking his head. That's something. The women laughed softly, a sound that filled the dusty kitchen with strange light. For a moment, Richard almost believed this arrangement could work. But the first conflict was already waiting. By noon, word had spread. The dust cloud from the crash had been visible for miles. Richard's neighbor, Hank Doyle, pulled up in his truck, boots crunching against gravel. Hank was the kind of man who trusted no one, least of all the government. He always had a rifle in the rack and suspicion in his eyes. Morning, Richard, Hank said, tipping his hat. His gaze flicked past Richard, toward the house. Heard a hell of noise last night. Sky lit up like the 4th of July. You see anything? Richard's pulse jumped. Behind him, faint movement stirred in the living room. The alien women, listening. He stepped forward, blocking the door with his frame. Didn't see much, Richard lied. Sounded like thunder, maybe a plane breaking apart. Dust settled quick. Hank squinted. Strange. Dogs were howling all night. My wife swears she saw fire. Folks will be talking in town. His eyes narrowed. You tell me if you saw something, wouldn't you, Rich? Richard forced a smile. Course. The silence between them stretched. Then Hank spat into the dirt, muttered something about government cover-ups, and left. The truck roared down the road, leaving Richard with his heart pounding. He shut the door fast. The women stood clustered near the staircase, their eyes wide with fear. The eldest, the regal one, stepped forward. They will come, she said simply. You're kind, curious, relentless. They will not stop until they know what fell from the sky. Richard rubbed his forehead. I can't just hide 11 of you. This is a small county. People notice. Another woman, her voice sharper, filled with bitterness, spoke. Then let us go. We will wander until we fade. We will not endanger you. Her words cut deeper than she meant. Richard saw the resignation in her face, the way she had already accepted death. It stirred something inside him, the same stubborn fire that had once driven him to stand his ground at borders, to fight storms, to bury a wife, and keep living anyway. No, he said firmly. You're staying. Whatever comes, we'll deal with it here. That night, tension thickened. The women huddled together, whispering in their language, voices rippling like a current. Richard tried to give them space, but curiosity clawed at him. He caught fragments when they switched to English, the translation strange but clear enough. They spoke of their home, a world of violet skies and silver oceans, where their people had lived in great spires that touched the clouds. Their mates had died in a war not of their choosing, victims of conquest. Their ship had carried refugees, but only one vessel survived the endless pursuit of their enemies. And now, 11 widows remained. Richard listened in silence. He had known war, but never at such a scale. What struck him most was not their loss. It was the quiet strength they carried, as if they had already borne the weight of despair and chosen to keep walking anyway. Still, the cracks showed. The youngest of them wept quietly at night. Another stared endlessly at the horizon, as if waiting for death to come. And the one with the wound grew weaker, her skin paling to a faint lilac. Richard did what he could, bandages, clean water, but his supplies were limited. On the third day, the conflict sharpened. Richard was tending to his cattle when he heard a shout. He ran back to the porch, rifle in hand. Two of the women stood facing each other in the yard, voices raised. Their words spilled in their alien tongue, sharp and cutting. The others circled, trying to calm them. The eldest turned to Richard, her voice heavy. They argue. One says we must leave, for we endanger you. Another says we must stay, for you gave us sanctuary. Both are right. Richard lowered his rifle slowly. The truth of her words stung. He had invited them, yes, but he hadn't thought through the cost. If the government came sniffing, or worse, the very enemies who had destroyed their world, his life would never be quiet again. And yet, when the women's voices cracked with grief, Richard stepped forward. His voice was steady, firmer than he felt. You're safe here. I don't care what it costs me. I already lost everything once. If I gotta lose more, then so be it. The words settled like a promise in the air. The argument quieted. Some of the women lowered their heads, tears streaking silver down their cheeks. For the first time since they had arrived, Richard saw not just sorrow, but hope flicker in their eyes. But the world outside was not silent. Late that night, Richard heard engines on the highway. Military, not civilian. Trucks, maybe moving toward the plains. His heart clenched. He went to the window. In the distance, faint lights combed the crash site. Search teams. The widows gathered behind him, their faces pale with dread. The eldest placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice low. They have found the wreck. Richard stared into the night. The sound of boots and shouts carried faintly on the wind. His ranch, once invisible to the world, had become the center of secret war. And he had 11 reasons not to walk away. The nights grew restless. Every evening, searchlights swept across the plains where the wreckage had fallen. Sometimes Richard could hear helicopters thundering overhead, rattling the windows of his ranch. He would stand on the porch in the dark, shotgun in hand, watching the sky with a tight jaw. The widows slept little. Some whispered prayers in their strange tongue, their voices weaving soft hymns into the night air. Others paced like caged predators, glancing toward the horizon where lights danced. Each of them carried grief, but now fear sharpened it into something heavier. Richard tried to hold his ground. They're just looking, he told them one evening. They'll clean up the wreck and move on. Folks out here don't like attention. Sooner or later, the army will pack up. The eldest shook her head. You do not know our hunters. They're not your kind. The word chilled him. Hunters. He realized she wasn't speaking about the U.S. military at all. By the fourth night, the sickness worsened. The young widow with the wound. Her name was Shira, though the syllables sounded fragile in his mouth. Grew pale, her breath shallow. Richard rummaged through his cabinets, desperate. He found bandages, iodine, painkillers, but nothing could fight whatever poison seeped through her veins. Her skin burned faintly violet under his lamplight. She needs more than I can give, Richard muttered. He hated how helpless he sounded. One of the widows placed her glowing hand over Shira's chest, whispering strange words. Richard watched as light pulsed faintly between them, but it faded fast, leaving both women weaker. He felt the old rage rise in him, the same rage that had once carried him through the day his wife died in that sterile hospital room, machines humming while doctors said there was nothing more they could do. No, Richard said. Not again. I'm not burying anyone else. The eldest met his eyes. Would you risk your world for ours? Richard didn't answer. His silence was enough. The next day, the first confrontation came. Richard was mending a fence along the back pasture when he saw a plume of dust rising on the horizon. A convoy, 2 jeeps, a Humvee. He dropped his tools and hurried back to the house. Inside, he told the widows. His voice was firm, commanding. Don't move, don't make a sound. The vehicles pulled up in a storm of gravel. Men in fatigue stepped out, their insignia hidden, rifles slung across their shoulders. The lead officer, a tall man with mirrored sunglasses, tipped his cap at Richard. Afternoon, sir. Sorry to bother you. We're with a recovery team, securing the area. You hear or see anything unusual the last few nights? Richard squinted. Like what? Lights. Strange noises. Maybe debris falling. Anything out of place. Richard forced a shrug. Heard the boom same as everyone. Dogs went crazy. Thought it was a plane. Didn't go near it. The officer studied him, expression unreadable behind the mirrored lenses. You mind if we take a look around? Protocol. Richard's grip tightened on the shotgun he held casually at his side. He could feel eyes watching from inside the house. 11 of them, wide and silver, hidden behind curtains. You got a warrant? Richard asked. The officer tilted his head. We don't need one. National security, sir. Richard's jaw clenched. This is private land. You want to step inside my house, you'll damn well need a piece of paper signed by a judge. Until then, you stay out here. The silence stretched. The men shifted uncomfortably, hands brushing their rifles. Finally, the officer gave a thin smile. Understood. If you see anything, you let us know. They turned and left, dust rising once more. But Richard knew this wasn't the end. They would be back. When he stepped inside, the widows stared at him as though he had pulled them from the edge of execution. One reached for his arm, whispering, "Why risk yourself for us?" Richard answered simply, "Because no one else will." That night, the ranch felt smaller, suffocating under the weight of fear. The women tried to keep busy, cooking meals from his supplies, singing soft songs to calm each other. But the air was thick with tension. Richard sat on the porch, nursing his second whiskey. He thought about his wife, about the quiet years of loneliness that had stretched like an endless road. For years, he had begged for something to break the silence. Now it had come, 11-fold, and it might cost him his life. A gentle presence stepped onto the porch. The eldest widow, her silver eyes reflecting the moonlight, sat beside him. "You do not trust easily," she said softly, "but you open your home." "Why?" Richard sighed. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything, to wake up every day and wonder why you're still here. I wouldn't wish that on anyone." She studied him for a long moment. "You carry sorrow. It is a language we understand." For the first time, Richard let himself meet her gaze without flinching. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was shared. The escalation came swiftly. 2 nights later, the ranch was woken by a low hum. The cattle stirred restlessly, dogs barked. Richard stepped outside and froze. Above the plains, a shape hovered. Not a helicopter, not a drone. Sleek, black, edges glowing with faint crimson light. It moved slowly, scanning the ground with beams that swept like searchlights. The widows rushed to the porch, their faces pale with terror. "They have come," one whispered. Richard gripped his shotgun uselessly. He knew the weapon meant nothing against something from the stars. His voice was steady, but his heart thundered. "Inside, all of you." The craft lingered for long minutes, searching. Then, without warning, it streaked across the sky and vanished into the night. The women clung to one another, trembling. One collapsed to her knees, whispering in anguish. The eldest turned to Richard, her expression grave. "Our hunters. They followed us. They will not stop until we are gone, or dead." Richard's blood went cold. He thought of the convoy of soldiers, of Hank's suspicious eyes, of the hovering craft above his land. His ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target, and he had to decide, would he keep hiding or would he fight? The ranch no longer felt like home. It felt like a fortress waiting for a siege. For days after the black craft swept across the prairie, Richard could barely sleep. Each time he drifted off, Headlights flared in his dreams, soldiers pounding at his door, neighbors whispering his name with suspicion. Each time he woke, the silence felt thinner, as if the world outside was holding its breath. The widows sensed it too. They moved like shadows through his house, their songs quieter, their laughter gone. Shira, the wounded one, grew weaker still. Her skin had faded to a pale lavender, her breaths shallow whispers. Richard sat at her side in the evenings, holding her hand, promising words he wasn't sure he believed. One night, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the decision was forced. It began with headlights. Richard was cleaning his shotgun when the gravel road lit up. A convoy again, 2 trucks, no insignia, their engines snarling through the night. They didn't stop at the gate this time. They rolled straight up to the porch. Richard stepped out, shotgun leveled. The widows clustered in the living room behind him, their eyes wide, silver glimmering in the dark. 4 men climbed out of the trucks. No uniforms this time, just black fatigues, faces hard. The leader raised his hand, not in peace but in command. "Evening, sir," he said flatly. "We need to come inside." Richard's grip tightened. "This is private land." The man's voice carried no patience. "You have something that doesn't belong to you. Step aside." Before Richard could answer, one of the widows gasped. Too loud, too human. The man's gaze shifted past Richard, toward the window. His eyes widened slightly at the glimpse of violet skin. "There," he barked. "Inside. Move." The soldiers surged forward. Richard fired. The shotgun roared, the blast tearing into the dirt at their feet. The men froze, startled more by his defiance than the weapon itself. Richard's voice cut through the night like a blade. "You don't set foot in my house," he growled. "Not while I'm still breathing." For a moment, no one moved. Rain began to fall, heavy drops striking the dust. Lightning flashed, casting the scene in harsh silver. One of the widows, trembling but fierce, stepped onto the porch beside Richard. Her hair whipped in the storm wind, her violet skin glowing faintly. Her voice rose, melodic and sharp. "We are not yours to claim." The soldiers lifted their rifles. Richard's heart pounded. He knew this was the line. His quiet life, his safety, his solitude, it was all gone. The storm had broken, and there was no turning back. The standoff ended not with a bullet, but with a retreat. Another lightning strike split the sky, and from above, a sound descended, the low, humming thunder of the hunter's craft. The soldiers looked up, cursed, and scrambled back to their trucks. Engines roared, gravel spat. Within seconds, they were gone, fleeing into the storm. The widows clung to each other, their fear tangible. Richard lowered his shotgun, his breath ragged. He looked at them, their faces pale, their eyes luminous with terror, and he knew. The hunters weren't coming tomorrow. They were already here, and no government convoy would stop them. That night, Richard made his choice. The widows gathered in the living room, their voices a chorus of grief. The eldest turned to him, her silver gaze steady. "You should send us away," she said softly. "Already, we have brought danger to your home. If you remain with us, you will fall." Richard stared at her. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision already made. "I've been falling for 17 years, he said. "Ever since my wife died. I thought I was done. Thought I'd rot out here, and no one would know, no one would care. But you showed up. 11 women from the stars, widows carrying grief heavier than mine, and still breathing, still fighting. You don't leave. Not now. Not ever." The eldest's eyes glistened. Around her, the others lowered their heads in quiet reverence. Even Shira, weak and fading, smiled faintly. Outside, thunder rolled. Inside, Richard Hale had chosen. He would fight. For the first time since the widows arrived, preparation replaced despair. Richard cleared out his barn, setting up places for them to hide if soldiers returned. He dug up old radios, maps, rifles stored since his service years. The women added their own touches. Strange violet crystals salvaged from the wreckage, placed like wards around the property. They hummed faintly at night, pulsing with energy he couldn't understand. But it wasn't just about defense. Something else was changing too. Richard noticed it in the way the widows looked at him now. Not just as a protector, but as something more. A partner in survival. A man who had chosen them, even at the edge of his own ruin. And though he didn't speak it, Richard felt it too. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. The turning point came fully when the eldest widow, her name was Alenia, he had finally learned, stood beside him on the porch the next evening. The storm had cleared, leaving the prairie washed clean, the stars burning bright. "You could have let them take us," she said quietly. "No one would have blamed you. Yet you stood." What? Richard thought of the silence that had haunted him all these years. Thought of the graves he'd dug, the empty dinners, the mornings where he brewed coffee for no one. He looked at her, at the 11 faces glowing faintly in starlight, and found his answer. "Because I've spent half my life losing," he said, "and I'm tired of losing." Alenia's eyes softened. For a heartbeat, the weight of galaxies seemed to lift. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something strong enough to stand against the night. As the hunters closed in, Richard knew the ranch would soon become a battlefield. The line had been drawn. There would be no peace unless he carved it with his own hands. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for them. If you've ever rooted for an impossible love, for a man who risked everything when he could have walked away, subscribe. There are more stories like this waiting for you. Morning came gray and heavy. The storm had passed, but it left the prairie soggy and scarred, puddles glimmering in the ditches. Richard stepped onto the porch with his coffee, real coffee this time, not the violet brew, and stared at the horizon. His land had never looked so fragile. The night before, he had drawn a line in the dirt. Now he had to live with it. Inside the house, the widows stirred quietly. No laughter, no songs. They had seen too much. Alenia, the eldest, moved with solemn purpose, helping the younger ones settle their nerves. Shira still lay weak, her breath shallow, her skin cool to the touch. Richard checked on her every few hours, but each time, his helplessness gnawed deeper. By mid-morning, the first sign of consequence arrived. A black SUV rolled slowly up the gravel road. Not Hank's dusty pickup, not a military convoy. This one was clean, polished, its tinted windows reflecting the prairie like a mirror. It stopped at the gate, but didn't come closer. Instead, a man in a suit stepped out, his shoes sinking awkwardly into the mud. Richard frowned, walking down the porch steps with his shotgun balanced casually in his hands. "Morning," the man said. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. "Mr. Hale." "That's me," Richard answered, his tone flat. The man adjusted his tie. "I represent a federal agency tasked with unusual recovery operations. I believe you know what I'm referring to." Richard's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man smiled thinly, as if he expected the lie. "We've traced signals to this area. Unregistered communications, energy readings that don't belong. Whatever fell from the sky, it's dangerous. You may think you're protecting something. In truth, you're endangering yourself, your neighbors, and possibly this entire state." Richard's grip tightened on the shotgun. "This is my land. Unless you've got a warrant, you can turn your clean shoes around and walk back to your shiny car." The man's smile faded. His eyes hardened. "Mr. Hale, think carefully. We always get what we're looking for. It's only a matter of how much damage is done before we do." For a moment, Richard felt the weight of his defiance crushing him. He saw the widows in his mind, fragile, desperate, already hunted. He knew this man spoke truth of kind, but surrender was no longer in him. "Then you'd better bring more than a suit next time," Richard said. The man studied him, unreadable, then turned and walked back to the SUV. Gravel spat as the vehicle rolled away, leaving Richard standing in the mud, heart pounding. He knew then, this wasn't just hunters from the stars. His own government was closing in. That night, Richard sat at the kitchen table, staring at the map he had spread out. The widows gathered around him, their glowing faces reflecting the lamplight. "They won't stop," he said. "Not the men in suits, not the soldiers, not the ones from the sky. If you stay, you'll have to fight. If you leave, we die," Alenia finished. Richard nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time to stop waiting for them to knock down the door." The widows exchanged glances. One of them, fierce and restless, leaned forward. "We cannot fight them with sticks and rifles. Our hunters wield power you cannot imagine." Richard's eyes drifted to the crystals they had placed around the ranch. Faint light pulsed within them, like captured stars. "Maybe you've got more fight in you than you think." But even as they planned, The consequences tore through them from within. Shira's condition worsened. Her fever spiked, her breaths ragged. Richard sat by her bed, holding her hand, whispering old prayers he hadn't spoken since his wife's passing. Alenia joined him, her voice carrying a hymn in their alien tongue. The two voices, one rough, one melodic, wove together in the silence of the night. Still, Shira's eyes dimmed. At dawn, she stirred weakly, her silver gaze meeting Richard's. "You gave me more days," she whispered, her words trembling. "That is more than I thought I would have." Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to promise her survival, but the lie wouldn't leave his lips. He only squeezed her hand and bowed his head. By evening, she was gone. The widows wailed, their voices echoing like broken glass across the prairie. Richard dug the grave himself, his hands blistering, sweat mixing with tears he didn't want to admit. They buried her beneath the lone oak by the barn. The soil was dark, the wind still. 11 had come. Now only 10 remained. That night, Richard sat on the porch alone, staring at the fresh mound of earth. He felt the weight of every choice, every cost. Protecting them meant loss. It meant pain. And yet, he couldn't stop. Alenia joined him quietly, sitting beside him. Her hand brushed his rough fingers. "You share our grief now," she said softly. "You are one of us." Richard didn't answer. He only stared at the sky, where faint red lights flickered on the horizon. The hunters were still searching, and they would come again. Days passed. Pressure tightened. Hank stopped by again, eyes sharp, questions sharper. The black SUV returned, lingering on the road but never approaching. At night, the hum of alien craft grew louder, closer. The widows adapted in small ways, learning his language better, helping with chores, weaving their strange songs into the rhythm of ranch life. But the grief of Shira's loss lingered like smoke. Richard felt it too. The cost of his choice had bled into the soil of his land. He knew there would be more. And yet, when he looked at the 10 women who remained, faces luminous, eyes both sorrowful and strong, he knew he would make the same choice again. The consequences had arrived, and they were only beginning. The grave by the oak tree changed everything. For 3 days after Shira's burial, silence gripped the ranch. The widows spoke little, their silver eyes dimmed, their voices gone hollow. Richard carried the silence with him, but he felt its weight differently. Where grief once smothered him into loneliness, now it demanded something else. Action. On the 4th morning, he woke before dawn. The prairie shimmered with mist, the grass silver under moonlight. He saddled his old horse, Duke, and rode out alone, pastures rolling endlessly around him. The air tasted sharp and clean, reminding him of his younger years, when he believed every day still held purpose. When he returned at sunrise, the widows were waiting by the barn. Alenia stepped forward, her face grave but steady. "You left us," she said simply. Richard dismounted, his boots sinking into the wet earth. "I had to clear my head." "You carry sorrow, but you also carry fire," she said. "If you burn alone, you leave us to ashes." Her words struck deep. For the first time, Richard realized the truth. They weren't only his burden. They were his people now. That day marked a shift. Richard gathered them in the barn. Dust swirled in shafts of sunlight, falling across the strange violet crystals the widows had planted along the walls. They pulsed faintly, as if waiting to be used. "We can't wait for them to come again," Richard said, his voice hard. "If we're going to survive, we prepare. This ranch is all we've got." We turn into a shield. The widows exchanged wary looks. One of them, tall, sharp-eyed, a fighter by nature, spoke. "We are not soldiers. We were wives." Richard nodded slowly. "So was my wife. But grief doesn't mean you stop fighting. It means you fight harder." Something sparked in their eyes, something more than sorrow. Hope. Training began. Richard taught them what he knew: how to handle a rifle, how to spot cover in open ground, how to move quietly across the prairie without raising dust. At first, their hands shook. Rifles were heavy, alien to their touch. But by the end of the week, they fired steady, their silver eyes narrowing with focus. In return, the widows taught Richard pieces of their own knowledge. They showed him how the crystals could resonate with their voices, humming with power when touched in harmony. He watched in awe as they sang softly, and the crystals flared, casting shields of faint violet light across the barn walls. "It is not much," Alenia admitted, "but it may buy time." Richard ran his hand across one of the glowing barriers, feeling the faint buzz against his skin. "Time's all we need." In those long days of preparation, connection grew. The widows began weaving their presence into ranch life, not just survival. They cooked meals with spices salvaged from their wreck, strange flavors that reminded Richard of places he'd never seen. They worked beside him in the fields, laughing softly when the cattle shied away from their violet glow. At night, their songs drifted through the halls, lulling the old house into something almost holy. And Richard, for the first time in 17 years, felt alive again. He found himself talking, really talking, about his wife, about the years of silence, about the regret of never having children. The widows listened, their eyes heavy with empathy. In turn, they told stories of their husbands, their homes, their lost skies. Pain threaded through every word, but so did strength. One evening, as the sun sank low, Richard sat with Alenia on the porch. The air smelled of rain, the horizon burning orange. "You've carried them all this way," Richard said quietly. Alenia's gaze was distant. "I was chosen, not because I'm strongest, but because I could still walk when others could not." Richard studied her profile, the way her white hair caught the last light of day. "You think strength is just lifting weight. It's not. It's standing when you want to lie down. It's burying your dead and still waking up the next morning. That's what strength looks like." For a long time, she said nothing. Then her hand brushed his, tentative, deliberate. "And you carry it too, Richard Hale." The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full, but connection wasn't without cost. That night, while Richard slept, the widows gathered by Shira's grave. Their voices rose in a hymn, soft and trembling. The crystals around the ranch pulsed faintly in response. Richard woke to the sound, stepping onto the porch to watch them. They swayed together, their white hair glowing, their voices carrying sorrow into the night sky. It was grief transformed, not an end, but a vow. Alenia turned, her silver eyes meeting his across the darkness. And Richard understood. They weren't just preparing for survival. They were becoming something more than refugees, more than widows. They were becoming his family. The next morning, the first test came. Duke neighed nervously, stamping the dirt near the fence. Richard grabbed his rifle, scanning the horizon. A drone, small, black, government issue, hovered above the fields, its camera a blinking red. Richard cursed under his breath. The widows ran from the barn, panic in their faces. One raised her hand instinctively, and a crystal flared. A violet wave surged upward, striking the drone. Sparks burst in the air as the machine spun and crashed into the dirt. The widows gasped. Richard stared at the smoking wreck, then at them. "You're stronger than you think," he said. For the first time, they believed it. That night, the house glowed with warmth. The widows sang softly as they cooked, weaving strange herbs with the scent of Richard's old recipes. Laughter echoed, real laughter, fragile but growing. Richard leaned against the doorway, listening, a small smile tugging at his lips. It was fragile, yes. It was dangerous, but it was life. And for Richard Hale, that was enough. The storm came without warning. It was near midnight when the first rumble shook the prairie. Not thunder, engines. Richard jolted awake, his old heart pounding, as headlights carved through the darkness beyond the ranch's fence. He grabbed his rifle, the familiar weight settling against his shoulder, and stumbled to the window. 3 black trucks roared across the open land, their beams slicing the night. Men leaned from the beds, weapons glinting under floodlights. Government insignias gleamed faintly on the doors. "They found us," Richard muttered. The widows were already awake. Their voices stirred the walls as they gathered crystals, their pale hair glowing in the dim. Fear hung heavy in the air, but beneath it was something fiercer, resolve. Alenia met Richard by the door. Her silver eyes locked onto his. "This is the moment," she whispered. "We stand or we are taken." Richard chambered round. "Then we stand." The truck screeched to a halt at the edge of the yard. Men in body armor fanned out, rifles raised, flashlights cutting through the dust. A loudspeaker crackled. "This property is under federal jurisdiction. Step outside immediately and surrender the extraterrestrial entities." The widows clustered behind Richard, their violet skin shimmering faintly in the floodlights. One whispered, trembling, "They will cage us." "Over my dead body," Richard growled. The loudspeaker boomed again. "Last warning." Richard raised his rifle and fired. The shot cracked like thunder, the bullet sparking off a truck hood. The standoff shattered into chaos. Gunfire erupted. Bullets whined against wood and stone as Richard dove behind the porch railing. The widows cried out, huddling. Then their crystals flared. Violet shields blossomed across the yard, deflecting incoming rounds and shimmering arcs of light. Sparks burst against the barriers like fireworks. Richard peeked over the railing, fired again. One soldier fell, another ducked behind the truck. But numbers were against them. "We can't hold forever," a widow shouted. "Yes, we can," Richard barked back. "Sing." And they did. The widows lifted their voices together, a haunting harmony that trembled the air itself. The crystals answered, pulsing brighter, weaving a dome of light across the ranch. Bullets slowed as if thickened by invisible hands, ricocheting harmlessly into the dirt. But singing cost them. Sweat beaded on violet skin, voices cracked, knees buckled. Richard saw it in their faces. They were burning themselves out. "Keep it up," he shouted, firing into the gaps. The soldiers regrouped, shouting orders. A rocket launcher appeared from one truck bed. Richard's blood froze. "Down," he screamed. The rocket streaked through the air, trailing smoke. The widow's harmony faltered, the shield rippling. The explosion tore through the barn, shattering wood and crystal alike. Flames roared upward, showering sparks across the night sky. The widow screamed. Richard's chest seized with fury. He ran into the open, rifle blazing. Bullets tore the dirt around him, but he kept moving, his old legs powered by something deeper than muscle. He dropped one soldier, then another, before diving behind the smoking ruins of the barn. "Richard!" Alenia's voice cracked, raw with terror. "I'm fine," he shouted back, though his shoulder burned where a bullet had grazed. The widow's song wavered, weaker now, their shield fading. Soldiers pressed forward, shouting, guns raised. Richard knew what had to be done. He crawled through the wreckage until his hand closed around one of the shattered crystals, still glowing faintly. It hummed against his palm, heat pulsing like a heartbeat. He remembered what Alenia had told him. It responds to harmony. Richard wasn't a singer. He was a broken old man with whiskey in his throat. But he tried. He lifted his voice, a rough, low hum, broken and jagged. The crystal flickered. He tried again, louder this time, forcing sound past the gravel in his chest. And the crystal blazed. A surge of violet light ripped upward, colliding with the shield overhead, reinforcing it with a brilliance that lit the night. The widows gasped, their own song swelling in response. Together, their voices fused, human and alien, grief and hope, rage and love. The dome hardened. Bullets flattened against it like rain against steel. For one heartbeat, the ranch was untouchable. But the soldiers weren't done. Another rocket streaked toward the house. Richard braced for impact. Shira's sister, a widow named Rhinal, broke from the group. She sprinted into the open, arms raised, her voice piercing the night in a solitary cry. The rocket curved, diverted, spiraled skyward before exploding harmlessly above. Richard's eyes widened. Rhinal, no. The effort tore her apart. She collapsed, her body smoking, violet skin dimming like a dying ember. The widows wailed. Richard's heart broke. Rage consumed him. He surged to his feet, holding the blazing crystal high, his rough voice merging with the widow's chorus. The light intensified until soldiers shielded their eyes, stumbling back. The truck's engine sputtered, lights flickered. "Leave," Richard roared, his voice carried by the resonance. "This land is ours." The dome pulsed outward like a shockwave. The first truck flipped, metal screeching. The second skidded into the dirt. Men fled, shouting, retreating into the dark as their vehicles sputtered and died. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of flames. The ranch still stood, barely, but at a cost. Richard staggered forward, the crystal dimming in his grip. He fell to his knees beside Rhinal's body, tears streaking the dirt on his face. The widows gathered, their wails soft and broken. Alenia knelt beside him, her hand trembling on his shoulder. She gave herself for us. Richard's voice shook. No one should have had to. Yet deep inside, he knew the truth. Sacrifice was the price of love, of family, of survival. He looked at the flames consuming the barn, the soldiers scattered into the night, the widows huddled close, bruised but alive. And he realized something else. They weren't widows anymore. They were his. The night after the battle felt endless. The barn was gone, reduced to glowing embers that smoldered against the pale dawn. Smoke curled lazily into the sky, the wind carrying with it the scent of ash, oil, and something else, loss. The widows stood in silence, their violet faces streaked with soot, their white hair tangled and singed from the fire. Reinald's body lay wrapped in a blanket, the closest thing to a burial shroud Richard could offer. They had carried her gently from the battlefield, singing low and mournful songs in their alien tongue. Even without understanding the words, Richard felt a grief, a hollow note in his chest that echoed louder than gunfire. He sat on the porch steps, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but he hardly noticed. Pain was background noise compared to the weight in his chest. Alenia joined him quietly. Her silver eyes, usually bright with determination, were dull with sorrow. She sat close, their arms brushing. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Richard rasped, "I should have done more." "You did everything," Alenia whispered. Her voice cracked, the words trembling. "Without you, we would all be gone." Ronald knew that. Richard shook his head. "Doesn't make it easier." "No," Alenia agreed, "but it makes it meaningful." As the sun climbed, the widows moved with slow, deliberate grace, cleaning the battlefield. They gathered shattered crystals, doused flames with buckets from the well, and salvaged what little could be saved from the barn. Their song returned in fragments, quiet harmonies as they worked, weaving strength into broken places. Richard limped among them, doing what he could. He hammered loose boards back into place, shoveled dirt over small fires, hauled wreckage out into the field. His hands bled, but he kept going. The widows mirrored him, exhaustion etched in their faces yet refusing to yield. By afternoon, the ranch looked less like a battlefield and more like a scarred home, damaged but still standing. That evening, they buried Reinald beneath the old oak at the far edge of the property. Richard dug the grave himself, every thrust of the shovel biting deep into the earth and into his heart. The widows stood in a circle, their violet hands clasped, singing softly. The melody rose and fell like a tide, wrapping around Richard as he worked. When the grave was ready, they lowered her down, covering her with soil until only the mound remained. Then they placed crystals along the top, glowing faintly in the dark, like stars fallen to earth. The song swelled, tears streaming down their faces. Richard stood with his hat pressed to his chest, throat tight. He wanted to speak, something about bravery, about sacrifice, but the words tangled in his throat. All he managed was a whisper. "Thank you, Reinald." The widows' voices carried it higher, turning his broken words into something eternal. After the burial, they gathered back on the porch. No one had the strength to cook. Instead, they passed around a loaf of bread Richard had stored in the pantry, tearing pieces with tired hands, sharing what little they had. Richard poured the last of his whiskey into a chipped mug and set on the porch rail. "For her," he said. The widows nodded, and one by one, they each touched the mug, their glowing fingers leaving faint traces of violet light on the glass. The whiskey shimmered like starlight, though none of them drank. It was an offering, not a comfort. As the night deepened, exhaustion finally pulled them down. The widows lay scattered across the house, curled in corners, draped across blankets on the floor, their breathing slow and heavy. Their glow dimmed to soft pulses, like embers in the dark. Richard stayed awake. He sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap, watching the horizon. His bones ached, his shoulder throbbed, but his eyes refused to close. He had lost too much already to risk another ambush. Alenia came out quietly, her hair loose around her shoulders, catching the moonlight. She sat beside him without a word, her presence steady and warm. "You should sleep," she murmured. I can't, Richard admitted. Not yet. Alenia studied him for a long moment, then leaned closer, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. Her voice was barely a whisper. You're not alone anymore. Richard swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in his eyes. He let the rifle rest against the railing, his arms sliding around her shoulders. For the first time in years, the silence of the ranch didn't feel empty. It felt full. The next morning, the widows rose early. Despite grief, despite exhaustion, they worked. They repaired fences, tended to the animals, and cleared wreckage from the barn. Their movements carried a quiet determination. Pain turned into purpose. Richard joined them, though every swing of the hammer sent fire through his shoulder. Alenia stayed close, steadying him when he stumbled, brushing dirt from his hands when he worked too long. You don't have to push yourself, she said gently. Yes, I do, Richard replied. This ranch is all I have left, and now it's yours too. Her silver eyes softened, and for a heartbeat, the sorrow in them lifted. By dusk, the ranch looked different again. Still scarred, still fragile, but alive. The fences stood. The animals grazed peacefully. The burned barn was only ash now, but the widows had begun laying out stones for a new foundation. The family had changed forever, but it was still a family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the widows sang again, not mournful this time, but hopeful. Their harmonies floated across the prairie, weaving with the wind, carrying light into the dark. Richard stood among them, his rough voice joining, low and cracked but steady. For the first time, he didn't hear loss in the song. He heard promise. The days that followed felt different. Not lighter, not easier. Grief didn't vanish with the sunrise, but steadier. The widows carried sorrow in their songs, yet they sang while working, their voices knitting pain into something livable. Richard felt it every morning when he stepped out onto the porch. The ranch was scarred, but alive, and so was he. Once, his mornings had been silent. Coffee in a chipped mug, the scrape of boots on the porch, the slow march of empty hours. Now the air carried voices, soft alien words drifting across the yard, the sound of laughter breaking unexpectedly through grief, the rhythmic clang of rebuilding. The ranch was no longer just his. It was theirs. One evening, as the sun bled across the plains in streaks of orange and violet, Richard found himself at the old oak tree. The mound where a rhino lay glowed faintly with the crystals the widows had placed there, pulsing like quiet heartbeats in the dirt. He stood there for a long time, hat in his hands, trying to shape thoughts into words. He wasn't much for praying anymore, not after the things life had stripped from him, but he found himself speaking softly into the dusk anyway. I don't know why you picked me, he murmured, or why it had to be here now, but I reckon you gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. Family, purpose, maybe even hope. The wind stirred the leaves overhead, whispering through the branches. For a moment, it felt like a reply. That night, Alenia came to him as he sat on the porch. The stars spread wide above them, clear and sharp against the black sky. She settled beside him, folding her long legs gracefully, her silver eyes reflecting starlight. You still watch the horizon, she said softly. Old habit, Richard answered. Hard to stop waiting for trouble. Alenia tilted her head. Maybe trouble will always come. But now, you do not face it alone. He looked at her then, really looked. The white hair flowing down her back, the violet glow at her temples, the quiet strength in her face. She wasn't fragile, wasn't a stranger anymore. She was part of his world, as real as the soil beneath the porch. Never thought I'd share this place with anyone again, he admitted. But I'm glad it's you. All of you. Her lips curved into a faint smile. We were dying. Lost. And then you opened a door. Richard chuckled low, shaking his head. Didn't feel like I had much choice. Perhaps not, Alenia said. But kindness is always a choice. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken truths, of grief that bound rather than broke, of hope that dared to breathe again. The widows began planting a small garden near the barn ruins. Strange alien seeds they carried in small pouches were pressed into the soil alongside Richard's old beans and corn. Together they watered them, and soon tiny shoots began to sprout, shimmering faintly under the moonlight. Richard would stand by the fence, hands in his pockets, watching the mingling of two worlds in a patch of earth. It felt right, like a promise that what had been broken could give way to something new. As days turned into weeks, he noticed changes in himself too. The ache in his shoulder dulled, though it never vanished. The nightmares came less often. The silence inside him, once as wide as the prairie, was no longer hollow. Sometimes he caught himself humming the widow's songs as he worked, low and off-key but steady. Sometimes he laughed with them, sharp and surprising, shaking the dust from his bones. And sometimes, when the night was quiet and the stars endless, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. One afternoon, while repairing a section of the corral, Richard paused, leaning on his hammer. The widows were nearby, carrying stones, their laughter mingling with the wind. He watched them move, graceful even in exhaustion, luminous even in sorrow, and realized something. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was life. Messy, painful, imperfect, but alive in a way he hadn't believed possible. Later that evening, the group gathered again beneath the oak tree, not in mourning this time, but in remembrance. They lit small lanterns Richard had kept in the barn, placing them among the glowing crystals. The widows sang, not sorrowfully, but with gratitude, their harmonies wrapping around the night. Richard stood with them, the lantern light flickering across his weathered face. He thought about the years he'd wasted in silence, the days that had stretched empty and gray. He thought about the door opening that night, the knock that changed everything. And he realized that while loss had carved deep into him, it had also made room. Room for voices, for connection, for something beyond survival. As the song faded, Alenia turned to him. "Do you regret it? Letting us in?" Richard met her eyes, steady and clear. Not for a second. She smiled then, a real smile, rare and radiant. It softened the night, cut through the weight of everything they'd endured. In that moment, under the wide American sky, Richard understood something he hadn't dared to believe since his wife died. He wasn't finished yet. His story wasn't over. The widows leaned against each other as they walked back toward the house, tired but lighter. Richard followed, his boots crunching softly in the dirt. Behind them, the oak tree glowed faintly, a beacon in the dark. The ranch was scarred. The widows were scarred. He was scarred. But scars meant survival. And survival, stitched together with love and loyalty, meant more than life. It meant living. Spring returned to the plains. The grass grew high and golden again, bending in the wind like waves across the sea. The wounds on the land had begun to heal, blackened soil replaced by green shoots, shattered beams rebuilt into sturdy frames. Life had a way of pushing forward, even after fire and blood. The ranch didn't look the same as before. It couldn't. The barn carried scars of flame, patched with alien alloys that shimmered faintly in the sun. The fences bore new carvings, symbols the widows had etched into the wood, blessings from their world. And the garden, once a quiet patch of corn and beans, now bloomed with impossible colors, plants from another galaxy rising beside Richard's stubborn crops. Everywhere he looked, the place bore proof. Two worlds had fused into one. Richard sat on the porch one morning, coffee steaming in his mug. He watched as the widows moved through the yard. Some tended the garden, their long white hair glowing in the dawn light. Others repaired tools, humming songs that mingled with the wind. One sat by the fence, sketching symbols into the dirt, teaching herself English letters from an old notebook Richard had given her. They were no longer refugees. They were home. And so was he. Alenia came to sit beside him, wrapping her fingers around a clay cup filled with the herbal brew they'd made from their own seeds. She glanced at the horizon, then at Richard, her eyes soft. "You smile more now," she said quietly. Richard chuckled, rubbing the edge of his mustache. "Do I? Must be all the noise around here. Hard to be miserable with 11 voices fussing over every chore." Her lips curved in amusement. "We are not gentle guests." He shook his head. "You're not guests anymore. This is your home. Always will be." For a moment, silence hung between them, warm and steady. Then Alenia set down her cup, leaned closer, and rested her forehead gently against his. It wasn't human, wasn't from Earth, but the gesture spoke clearer than words. Gratitude, trust, something deeper that had grown between them, fragile but real. Richard closed his eyes, letting the contact linger. His heart, weathered and scarred, beat steady beneath the weight of it. The widows had begun building something of their own at the edge of the property. A small structure, half barn, half temple, using wood, stone, and pieces of their ship. They told him it was a place of memory, a space to honor their dead while shaping the future. At night, Richard would walk past it and hear their songs rising into the dark. They weren't mourning anymore. They were remembering, celebrating, and promising never to forget. Sometimes he joined them. His voice cracked and stumbled over the strange syllables, but they welcomed it, weaving his broken notes into their harmony. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like an outsider to life. He fell inside of it. The ranch began to draw attention too. A neighbor had stopped by, jaw nearly falling when he glimpsed the alien women moving about. Rumors spread quietly across the county. Stories of strange lights, strange crops, strange beauty hidden in the hills. But Richard didn't care. Let the world talk. For once, gossip didn't matter. What mattered was the laughter spilling from the porch, the strange alien songs drifting across the fields, the feel of hands beside his when work was done. The widows hadn't just found refuge. They'd given him back a life worth living. One evening, months after the first knock at his door, Richard stood once more beneath the oak tree. The crystals around Reinald's grave pulsed softly, casting faint violet light across the ground. The widows stood with him, their voices raised in harmony. Not sad, not broken, but strong. Richard lifted his hat, pressing it to his chest. For a long time, he said nothing. Then softly, "You changed everything. All of you. I thought my days were done. I thought I was just waiting out the clock. But you gave me back the fight, the love, the reason." The widows bowed their heads. Alenia touched his shoulder, steady and sure. "Her death was not the end," she said. "It was the bridge." Richard looked out across the plains, where the last light of the sun bled into the horizon. And for the first time in decades, he didn't see an ending. He saw a road stretching forward, full of unknowns, but alive with possibility. That night, as stars blazed overhead, Richard sat on the porch surrounded by the 11 women. Some leaned against him, others rested on blankets, all of them gazing up at the sky. The night was alive with cricket song and the rustle of prairie wind. And Richard realized something that made his chest ache with a strange, fierce joy. He wasn't alone anymore. Not in grief. Not in life. Not ever again. Final words to the reader. If you've ever believed in impossible love, in second chances, in the power of strangers becoming family, then you've walked this road with Richard and the 11 widows. Thank you for staying to the end of their journey. If this story touched you, drop a comment and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe. There are many more tales of impossible love, survival, and humanity waiting for you. Because sometimes the strangest knock on the door can change everything.